When we talk about exorcism in Italian films, most people consider the Italian productions to be rip-offs of the highly successful American production of The Exorcist in 1974 by William Friedkin. You have to see that the popularity of the book and the film The Exorcist didn't come from nothing. It was probably due to a deep mistrust which grew in the late 60s during the popularity of counterculture between the children generation and the parent generation. And the parents didn't understand their children anymore. There was a huge gap between the generations, and films like Rosemary's Baby, which is probably one of the first really modern horror films of American cinema in 1967, or especially the film The Exorcist, which is a really realist approach of a mother-daughter relationship. These films reflect on this huge gap of the generations, and they use the religious aspects, the demonic possession, or the insemination by the demon in Rosemary's Baby as metaphors of this deep-rooted fear of this gap of generations. In Italy, exorcism especially and demonic possession has a very long tradition, because Italy is really influenced by the Vatican and the Catholic religion. And within the Catholic rituals, there is the rite of the exorcism, which is known to a lot of people there. And this doesn't count for the American society, because American society, which is Christian obviously, but mainly influenced by the Protestant and the evangelical tendencies within Christianity, and these tendencies have no rite of the exorcism, which is really Catholic. And so exorcism appears in Italian cinema much earlier than 74. There is, for example, the film The Demon in 1963 by Brunello Rondi, starring Dalia Lavi as a possessed country girl, which is exorcised in a certain point, and there's even a scene of a spider walk, this backwards walk, which was cut from the original version of The Exorcist by Friedkin, but later appeared in the reversion in the 2000s. So this film in 1963 was a precursor of the American film, obviously. And we have a strong tendency within the films by Mario Bava, which relate to all this Catholic, demonic elements, and films like The Whip and the Body, also starring Dalia Lavi in 63, is a film about possession, obviously. There is a phenomenon that in 1972, Mario Bava made a film which is probably one of his best horror films, Lisa and the Devil. And this film was later re-edited when The Exorcist became so successful that Lisa and the Devil was recut as House of Exorcism. And there was a reshooting of an exorcism scene, actually, in this film. Also, there is some films which explicitly refer to The Exorcist by William Friedkin, yet they are different. Those two films especially are Beyond the Door by Ovidio Assonitis and The Antichrist by Alberto De Martino. Both films have very similar scenes when it comes to the details of the possession and how the victim of the possession behaves, and how obscenities dominate the dialogues, and how the body is abused by the demonic energies and so on. There's also this green puke matter which appears, but it is handled differently in those films than compared to the American one. You have to see that William Friedkin is not a Christian director. He is an agnostic, and he is has a different approach. He wanted to film the successful novel The Exorcist as if it would be a kind of documentary. In fact, it looks like a social realist drama in the typical New Hollywood style of that time in America. While the films The Antichrist and Beyond the Door, they are really genre horror films in the Italian style, and both films go much further when it comes to the special effects and horror scenes. And this is an important point because William Friedkin keeps it very low when it comes to supernatural elements. And these supernatural elements are clearly affirmed in both films, Beyond the Door and The Antichrist, meaning that it is obvious that a possession takes place and that the exorcism actually is necessary in these films. When you see the William Friedkin film, it is very close to natural science elements. There is a lot of medical research in these films, and all this is in return turned down in the Italian versions, which have a lot more gruesome horror things going on. So if you're searching for this horror element in demonic possessions and exorcism, you actually would go for the Italian versions. There's also a Spanish variant, the Demon Witch Child, which appeared in 1975, which is also a kind of rip-off of The Exorcist, and it was handled and marketed as that. It has to be said that especially Beyond the Door was a film that was sued by Warner Brothers for the similarities to the American film, and Warner Brothers actually won that case. So these films are really close, all three of these films, and Spain is also very much influenced by Catholic religion and Catholic Christianism. So you have a similar approach of the Spanish film and the Italian films in that case. In Germany, exorcism has a different taste because there has been a very frightening case in 1976, which I was told as a child when I was on holiday with my parents, and we visited a church, and there was this story told about Anneliese Michel, a young theology student who seemed to be, or was said to be, possessed by demonic forces, and she was treated with an exorcism and died of starvation later. So she was actually abused and mistreated within this rite of the exorcism, and in fact she was mentally ill and should have been treated differently. Obviously. But this case in 1976, which came after The Exorcist, was then a point of reference for later films, which were very popular in the 2000s. As you know, there had been some sequels, actually, of the American Exorcist, and there had been new exorcism films like The Exorcism of Emily Rose in 2005. And there's also been a German production called Requiem in 2006, which directly refers to the death of Anneliese Michel. So these films are completely different. It's a completely different approach to the same phenomenon compared to the Italian films. Well, nunsploitation. Nunsploitation as a word, as a term, refers to nuns as a phenomenon and to exploitation films. Films exploiting the life and especially the sexuality and intimacy of nuns in a monastery, in a cloister. So these films sexualize the life of nuns, and they fetishize the figure of the nun and the costume of the nun. So these films, the nunsploitation films, are a specialty in European countries with a strong Catholic influence, countries that actually know nuns from personal encounters. which is not that obvious in other countries where there's not such a strong influence of Catholic religion. So most of these films, the Nunsploitation films, were produced in Italy, in Spain, some of them, and there is some variety with Japanese films, because in Japan at certain times Christians were the victims of a Christ hunt, actually, and so you find films like Shogun's Joy of Torture, which refer to the torturing and killing and executing of Christians, especially of nuns, which is also sexualized nuns, because most of these nuns are shown to be really young and beautiful and so on. In Italian cinema, this is special because there have been a lot of films, even in earlier years than the 60s and 70s, which are mainly interesting here, adapting novels, for example, by Stendhal, or novels by Diderot. The Nun is one of those sources. And there have been myths and historical stories like The Nun of Monza, which were filmed several times. Nun of Monza is, for example, was filmed in the 40s, 2 times in the 60s, and it was referred to in the 70s and in the 80s, actually, and probably also in some pornographic adaptations. So there were films elsewhere, like in Poland with Mother Joan of the Angels. There have been British films like The Devils, film by Ken Russell in 1971. But other than with other tendencies of exploitation films, which mainly rip off and follow very successful American productions, these Nunsploitation films can refer to Italian films like The Nun, The Lady of Monza in 1969, which also is an adaptation of The Nun of Monza by Eriprando Visconti. And this film was followed by, for example, The Story of a Cloistered Nun and The Nun and the Devil by Domenico Paolella in 72 and 73. Very aesthetically, very high-level productions which also sexualize the life of nuns. There has been actually a rip-off of The Devils called The Demons by Jesus Franco Manera, but this is a Spanish co-production. And there has been a very important kind of edgy exploitation art house mixture called Flavia the Heretic, which appeared in 1974. All of these films refer to a kind of sexual possession of the nuns, which are, as the films suppose, are kind of underfucked, if you say it in a modern way. And so they develop a strong fetishistic and sadomasochistic rituals, which seem like a demonic possession from the outside. So most of these films also contain hints to exorcism rituals, or also torture and Inquisition-like rituals, as those films are mainly located in historical situations, like in the past. There have also been Nunsploitation films in other countries, like in Japan, with School of the Holy Beast being very popular. And there are also historical films, because in the samurai era, there have been hunts for Christians at some times, and films like Shogun's Joy of Torture, for example, they show also show nuns being inquisitioned and questioned and tortured. So this is also an aspect of world cinema, and there's also a film by Walerian Borowczyk, the great erotic master from Poland, who filmed in France, mainly Behind Convent Walls is such a film. And there have been later examples in the 80s, for example, but also until the 90s, a film by Mario Baino called Dark Waters refers to the Nunsploitation phenomenon as well. So this is a thing that reappeared in Italian film history. and which was never lost because of the strong Catholic identity within Italy.